Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out today, or rather staying in to join us to talk about psychedelic medicines. I'm Jeff Siegel of Green Chip Stocks, and I'm joined by Shark Tank investor and founder of O'Leary Ventures, Mr. Kevin O'Leary. I'm also joined by J.R. Rahn, the co-founder and co-CEO of psychedelic pharmaceutical company MineMed. So let's just jump right in. We got a lot to get to. So here we go. J.R., first and foremost, can you please tell us how you started MineMed and how you were able to convince Mr. Wonderful to invest into this new growing space?
Sure. Well, I think I don't come from the biotech space. I'm a technology entrepreneur. I was an earlier employee at Uber. I went through the Y Combinator program where companies like Airbnb and Dropbox came out of. So not a traditional person that you would think to go and start a biotech company focused on the psychedelic space. But what ultimately I saw when I was in Silicon Valley was a microdosing trend, microdosing of LSD, in a lot of the top companies. I saw some of the smartest guys in the room microdosing and using psychedelics for therapeutic potential. But at the same time, I was looking at my friend's self-driving car company, an automatic barista. And I was looking around the room and going, where is everybody going to work in 10 years' time? And then I read this report by, I think it was Deloitte, that was saying that 800 million people were going to lose their jobs by 2030. That all just got fast forwarded. And so what ultimately is going to happen, I think, in these uncertain times and during job losses, mental health and addiction are going to skyrocket. And I saw that there was a need for disruptive medicines in this space. And that's why I went about starting MineMed, ultimately to help people. I think there's a lot of big problems in North America and globally. In terms of getting Kevin on board with us, he actually turned me down the first time I talked to him about MineMed. I actually remember the day quite well. We were sitting at a table outside in Toronto, and he said to me, I think you've mistaken my last name. It's not Leary, it's O'Leary, and I'm not investing in psychedelics. Get lost. But then I called him back the next day, and he said, okay, let's talk this over further. I want to understand, what are the legal ramifications of this? Because, he has institutional funds. So we were able to explain that. But he can go into that story better.
Okay, Kevin. So I want to hear it from you. You were an early investor and also followed on in the pre-public round. That being said, you've also been an outspoken critic of the cannabis industry and many of the public companies in the space. What do you see in psychedelics?
So, when you think about a new medicine, which is, I was intrigued. I'd also heard the anecdotal evidence because I do a lot of investing in Silicon Valley about microdosing, and I do not endorse it. It's illegal. So but I've also heard the outcomes, and I was very intrigued. And you're right. I never invested in cannabis for one singular reason. It's a Schedule I narcotic federally, and when you're creating a new medicine or a new industry, the innovators and the pioneers and the entrepreneurs are the starts. The JRs, he starts the company, he sees the opportunity, but you need a huge amount of institutional capital to bring these medicines to fruition. And I know that. I've been investing in various biotech deals my whole life, and so and I kept telling the cannabis guys this: you don't get it. When it comes time to transition from the retail investor, and I get all that, and I think you've done a great job getting this nascent industry off the ground. You have two huge problems. You have an illegal drug that no institution will ever touch because nobody can afford to breach the RICO statutes. That's where you cross state lines with an illegal substance. If you're a fiduciary, you can't do that. And there's a whole lot of technical reasons for why you can't, because the cannabis industry kept saying, well, it's recreational. Yeah, it's going to be cleared in every state. No, it isn't. Never. Mothers Against Drunk Driving and all kinds of other groups that I know well are never going to let that happen quickly. So, and the other problem the cannabis people had is, why are you growing a weed in an Arctic climate? How stupid is that? It's the most expensive way to do it. You should be growing this near that border where you get 5 crops. So I never understood the investment thesis. It was a really bad one. And of course, that industry has lost, if not billions, I don't know what in market cap as a result of these two things coming to fruition. Now you jump to MineMed. So my first question to JR when we were talking about this was, are you going to pursue recreational psychedelics? Because if you are, I don't even want to waste my time talking about it. I have zero interest in getting involved. And he said, no, we have no interest. We want to go through FDA approval on these medicines through the trial system and bring medicines to the market. Okay, well, that was interesting. I said, really? Okay, well, tell me more. And then in my shop, we have a team of people that do due diligence. I get a lot of deals thrown at me, just a lot. And I see a lot of stuff. And I showed this one to the head of O'Leary Ventures, a guy named Alex Kenjeev, who's very strong in doing due diligence across a wide range of sectors. And he always does the work on these things. And he went to town on MineMed. He ripped into that thing for weeks. And JR could speak of the misery he went through with Alex. But that's just the way it is. If you want me as an investor, my guys have to get on board. And Alex, for the first, in the way I run my shop, and you'll find this intriguing, I say to Alex, okay, if you're gonna do the due diligence on an opportunity, pick any company. I've got a portfolio of over 50 companies, and you like it, and you go craft a deal for me. You have to eat your cooking. I'll lend you 15% of the position, and you have to borrow it from me, because if it goes to zero, you owe me the money. And if you don't take the full 15% from me, then I'm not doing the deal. That way I know his kahunas are in the right place on any deal. And he's made a lot of money with me. We've had a long relationship, and it's a great way I have capital to deploy. Every day I have capital to deploy. So he finds the deals, he works them, he takes 15%, I do them. This is the only time in history, in I don't know how many years it's been, a lot of years, where he said to me, look, boss, I'm taking the full 15%, and I want to let you know I'm investing more than you are. I said, and like that blew my mind. That really blew my mind. I said, what do you know about this? What has got you so jazzed on this deal? And he had done a tremendous, JR could speak to the amount of due diligence Alex did, but he really sold me on the fact that he was willing to take that kind of risk. And I, in fact, then increased I can't have Alex owning more than me, so I increased my position in subsequent rounds. But you got to understand this investment. For everybody that we're talking about, this is a binary outcome. It's either a zero, because none of these medicines work, or it's a huge outcome. Because the problems you're trying to, and that's why I'm so intrigued, the problems you're trying to solve are massive, multi-billion-dollar problems. Opioid addiction, alcoholism, ADD, anxiety. They're billion-dollar businesses. Coming out of this thing, how many people are going to have anxiety, worried about their jobs, alcoholism, opioid addiction? We got to solve these problems. And there haven't been any new medicines forever in this space. And so now, instead of taking some crappy medicine that has horrible side effects, if your child has ADD, potentially a microdosing strategy might work better. I don't know yet, but I want to find out. And I certainly want to be an investor if it works. If any of these trials work, this company will be extremely valuable. That's my investment thesis.
Well, you've definitely separated, because I know some people are trying to make that comparison from the cannabis market to this market. And it's very, very clear that, you believe that, this is going to be, massively bigger than cannabis has been or could ever be, for, all the reasons you just mentioned. So everything completely makes sense, in what you're saying. So JR, I need to know, and I think a lot of other people really want to know, what are your focus areas going to be? Kevin just mentioned some pretty big markets, right? Mm-hmm. So what do you see as the biggest one to address?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to talk about Alex. Kevin, he has some really, really smart guys, but he also has some huge jerks who work for him. They're very, very tough on due diligence. If you think he's tough, you should be, some of the guys that are working. Alex, spent a lot of time going through what we were doing, and actually, I think pushed me to really better understand a lot of things and potentials down the line. But in terms of the markets that we're most interested in, it's mental health and addiction. This is the broader space. We have really two drug programs right now, one being our 18MC program that's focused on solving the opioid crisis and dealing with opioid addiction and withdrawal. And then we have a microdosing program for LSD, which was very a prevalent illegal self-medication trend in Silicon Valley when I was working out there. And so we're going to be addressing ADHD with microdoses of LSD. You know, the ADHD market's worth $16 billion a year. That's a huge, huge market. I was one of the kids that they put on stimulant-based medicines, right? Wow. From the age of 13, I was put on, Concerta, Ritalin, Adderall, you name it. These are addictive substances, and frankly, the question really begs, should they be given to kids? But I think there's my generation. I would remember I was in Toronto. I was wearing my MineMed shirt, and it said there was a different one. It says psychedelic inspired medicines, and the waitress came up to me and she said, "What are you doing with psychedelics?" And I said, "Okay, we're doing clinical trials. Who do you work with?" So what she said to me was, "Look, I just got off of my Ritalin. I've been on it since I was 6 years old, and I'm microdosing LSD." And that was a real aha moment for me, which was, wow, this could be really big. I think there's a trend amongst my generation that wants to get off these stimulants. And so I think it's going to be extremely interesting. It's also the opioid market, that drug market has caused the opioid crisis, which now contributes to a $500 billion a year impact to our economy. That is a very big problem. It is also a national declared national health crisis. And we have COVID-19, which is a declared national health crisis. We have two national health crises going on at the same time, and they're very intermingled, right? Addiction and what will come out of COVID-19. I think the biggest impact that we're going to see is around mental health and addiction. So we'll be addressing those problems with psychedelic medicines. The company was set up to develop medicines that are based on psychedelics. We're going to do that through the FDA. We're never going to get involved in recreational psychedelics. We feel that the most efficient path to market for both our shareholders and ultimately the patients that are in desperate need of these medicines is through the FDA. And there's a clear way to do it in a legal manner. It's federally legal, and institutional investors can invest into it. So I think it's a very noble cause that we're addressing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, to that point, Kevin, the opioid crisis is affecting the U.S. and Canada in profound ways. You previously mentioned that you think that addiction is a catalyst to look at psychedelic medicine. So, and you've been a really big supporter of veterans. Do you think our nation's veterans will finally have their needs met in terms of suicides, PTSD, and drug addiction through psychedelics? And in addition to that, do you think the FDA and Washington is going to take companies like MineMed seriously?
I think the data will determine how seriously the FDA takes any company. I mean, this is a nascent industry. MineMed's not the only one pursuing the opportunity and then the solutions. But particularly for opioid addiction, which is a national, catastrophe, because everybody knows someone through family extensions that's been affected by this, and it's usually a horrifically bad outcome. This is a terrible affliction. And so my guess, and I'm speculating when I say this though, that if the FDA believed that the data coming out of the trials, they could potentially accelerate it just to solve for that problem. And I would expect it would be given a serious consideration for Fast Track, because anytime you can find a medicine, it's the same issue for this coronavirus. You have to deal with it. But when you're talking about billions of dollars affecting the economy on an ongoing basis with opioid addiction alone, you have to deal with it. And there just aren't any good medicines. solving for opioid addiction with more opioids is a really dumb idea. Like, it doesn't work. That's the problem. And so when you look at these outcomes, the potential outcomes, and suicide as well, I have investments in vet-based businesses, and it's a big problem. We ask these men and women to serve us and risk their lives, and then they come home and sometimes seriously afflicted. There's a compassion for that. And if these trials show that microdosing can help, there's no question that I think it's all data. And the whole thing is data. And so the most important thing the whole industry can do, including MineMed, is get the data and get working and get the trials going and start to test these anecdotal outcomes of all these people microdosing illegally, because they're doing it because they think they're getting good outcomes. Well, let's find out exactly. That's the whole reason. But at least in the case of MineMed, I feel comfortable that when if it gets good data, and I'm optimistic one of these drugs is going to work and get to the next level, it'll have access to institutional capital. Because every institution I talk to about this asks me the same question. Are they pursuing recreational psychedelics? No, they're not. And because these guys have been through this whole dance with cannabis. Every one of them has. The sovereign funds, the institutional, the pensions, they all know the story. But they also know how big these markets are. So the answer to MineMed, at least I can speak to that company because I've been grilling the board and the scientists and JR ad nauseum about it, is no, they're not. They're going to use the capital to grow the trial base and accelerate the release of these medicines if the release is merited. And so I think they'll get access to institutional capital. If you're going to be the long game, and I am the long game on MineMed, I've made a substantive investment here, and I'm hoping for a good outcome. But I say it's binary. It's either going to be worth it a lot or nothing. But that's the nature of what we're doing here. I'm an optimist, so I tend to err on the side of let's prove out all this anecdotal stuff. Let's get some real data. And I believe the institutional capital will be there for you if the data supports it.
No, I agree 100%. And in terms of, like we were talking about the government and the FDA being involved, I mean, they do, and you're absolutely right. Like those decisions are made based on data. In terms of government support, JR, what are your thoughts about that, about government support and even funding?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's no secret that the federal government has supported our 18MC project in the past. The National Institute on Drug Abuse gave us $6.8 million. That's part of the National Institute on Health. I think those institutions will have more funding for mental health and addiction as COVID-19 continues on. I think that there's probably going to be a lot of recovery and stimulus funds that will flow to those organizations. And so we're going to look at those groups as a way to also fund some of the trials that we're working on. Government funding can be quite abundant if you are working on something that they are concerned about. And I think mental health and addiction, we saw President Trump already talk about how he feels that it's going to be one of the biggest mental depressions, not an economic depression, but a mental depression over the next few years. So when people like that are concerned, that's usually when dollars flow to institutions that can fund companies like ours. There's some scary things coming out of COVID-19 right now in the space that we're working in. I mean, if you look at this isolation, this great lockdown, there's some animal models that demonstrate that rats, their addiction went up 19-fold when isolated versus being in a social group. We are social animals just like they are. And so when you have a 19-fold increase, that is scary, right? And so the opioid crisis was big before COVID-19. It's going to be even bigger afterwards. Other scary things, one of my team members, who's our resident data scientist at MineMed, Colin, we were going through the Xanax prescriptions in March, just looking at, is there a trend here? And what we saw was really scary. I mean, 14.5% increase since last year for the same time period. I was standing in line the way that I got this idea was I was standing in line at the pharmacy, and the person in front of me was being prescribed Xanax for the first time. And she was talking to the pharmacist, and she was explaining, oh yeah, my doctor gave this to me because I've been watching the news and feeling really anxious. We've been talking a lot about the opioid crisis. What we haven't been talking about is the looming Xanax crisis that will be coming to a neighborhood near you very soon. There's huge comorbidity issues between opioids and Xanax or benzodiazepines, Valium, those kind of things. So look out for that. Not going to be good, but I think we will be addressing anxiety in the not too distant future. We just acquired a phase 2 trial based on LSD, which is extremely interesting for us. I think we'll be looking at how do we convert this phase 2 trial, which was happening in the academic space, into a commercial drug trial. And that is a macrodose. That's not a microdose. That's our first hallucinogenic drug trial. And we see great promise in hallucinogenic medicines. And I think anxiety will be a very interesting market for us to look at. So, yeah.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about this, because when you talk to someone about psychedelics, or you say, hey, I'm going to invest in this psychedelics company, their immediate reaction is not medicine. Most people, they think, oh, what's this? What do you mean psychedelics company? But the way you're explaining this, I feel like I'm talking to a pharma guy. You know what I mean? Like I don't even consider this really a psychedelic. I wouldn't even call it a psychedelics play. It's, oh, this is another, to me, MineMed is really like a biotech pharma play, and Kevin, I mean, do you think MineMed could maybe one day become like a blue chip pharma company like Pfizer, or do you think will one day have an O-shares index tracking psychedelics or mental health?
I think there's a tremendous amount of interest in this. Remember, this work was being contemplated back in the late 50s and 60s, and then the drug got abused as a psychedelic recreational drug, and it got rescheduled to Schedule 1 narcotic, and the research was basically stopped. But also there was the bad news of the military trying it, and there was all kinds of negative news around that. But the real opportunity to understand it in microdose forms hasn't really been pursued until now. And so, and it's partly a result of decades long of no solutions to these horrific problems we've been talking about. There's been so many attempts to solve for alcoholism and addictions and depression and all of this. I think society now takes a different look at this, spurred on by the anecdotal evidence that it may be working. And I keep saying it to everybody, I don't endorse microdosing, it's illegal. I'd rather get it proven. But MineMed and other companies will pursue this, and the data will take us to where the data takes us. And I'm pretty optimistic some of these medicines are going to look effective. And you're right, it'll create a new class of medicine. Big pharma will immediately start to take a lot of interest in these companies, which is part of the investment thesis. But the job MineMed has now for the next foreseeable future is to prove out these molecules and get these trials going in whatever country. I don't care, Switzerland, America, South America, people are people everywhere. And if the outcomes are good, wherever they're made good, as long as they're FDA approved trials, that's how the company creates value. That's what it should be doing then. That's all I expect them to do. And of course, stay out of the debate of all these crazies that want to make this a recreational drug. That's a very bad idea, and not investable.
Well, it's interesting because MineMed has outperformed the broader market by something like 65%, and the most traded biotech ETF by almost 50%. So, you're right. I mean, it's we're already seeing the beginnings of what you're explaining to us, and JR. I mean, I'm really curious to know what your strategy is in building this business into a large listed company. How do you actually commercialize psychedelic medicines, and what do you see as the barriers to entry?
Yeah, and I think your observation around us being a biotech or pharmaceutical company are quite astute. We are. If you look at our team, my co-founder, Stephen Hurst, has been in the biotech space for 40 plus years. He has some FDA approvals under his belt. He's been part of large efforts with the World Bank to immunize many people in Africa. He brings a thought leadership to this space that I think is drastically needed, which is that these are pharmaceutical drugs that need to be developed to help people that are in need. And he's been advising the Hefter Institute and some of the other nonprofits in the space. And, I think our objective is, look, we see that clearly there is a need for these medicines. We don't want to get into a debate around whether it should be legal on a state-by-state basis. We want to go for the path of least resistance that allows people to begin using these substances as medicines. And we're always going to stay in that lane. There are going to be other folks that want to focus on other markets, but that's just not of interest to us. And we know what our lane is, and so we'll stay there. In terms of how we're going to build a business here and how we're ultimately going to commercialize this for both our shareholders and also how do we get these on the market for our patients, it really takes a principle of patient obsession. It's, how do we find the best solutions for them? And in order to do that, you need GMP material for a lot of these substances. That's not an easy thing to accomplish. It's definitely a barrier to entry. I don't think a lot of the folks that are rushing into this space quite understand the implications of actually scaling up their own processes and accessing these medicines so that they can conduct the drug trials. It's not just growing mushrooms in your backyard. They will never be accepted by the FDA in order to conduct a drug trial. So our job is to really bring that very traditional approach to how drugs are developed for a substance that isn't necessarily something that most doctors would want to talk about. And I think we're still going to have to get over a lot of stigmas around it, but the only way that we can do that is through data. And that is what the FDA process is. The FDA process literally is go find the data, present it, show us that it's safe and effective, and then they will give you an approval. And so that's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to get into the politics of these substances. We'll focus on the data. It's very hard to argue with real data packages. And so I think that's ultimately how we create a commercial market here. I think that's also why a large pharmaceutical company would be interested in this space, like Johnson & Johnson. They got esketamine approved. It took them about, I think 3 years from phase 2 to phase 3 they have got breakthrough therapy designation. So, big pharma's looking at the space, and we might look at partnerships with them that ultimately would enable our company to deploy these medicines in a faster way to patients. And I think that should be everyone's objective for the next few years until we have approved psychedelic medicines.
Got it. So I did want to make sure we got to a couple of questions that were submitted earlier. So I want to jump to one of those right now. Mike Franks from the Psychedelic Pharma Fund has asked, the Basel relationship is of tremendous value for mind medicine into the future. And I'm not sure the investment community has valued it into share price yet and even understands it. Can you explain how you see this relationship driving enterprise value for mind medicine into the future?
Yeah, sure. I agree with you, Mike. I don't think the market really has understood how vast and interesting this data is that we were acquired. So let me just to give everyone that's watching some context. I went to Switzerland, which is the birthplace of LSD, and I met with the leading pharmacologist and researcher in the LSD space, Dr. Matthias Liechti. And I said, look, Dr. Liechti, you have this amazing portfolio of clinical trials, and you've really kind of been doing it on a shoestring. Like, he's been self-funding a lot of these trials. He had some philanthropists that, here and there would donate. But has some of the best, PK data on LSD, looking at the toxicology of LSD. And so he said, look, we want to start a partnership with you. We want to take your existing data, and there's some very interesting things in there that would potentially like to patent and develop further. There's some interesting ideas that you've come up with. But the other thing we want to do is give you funding to keep advancing LSD, to keep finding new technologies. And so that's what we're doing. He has a phase 2 study in anxiety that will be finishing soon. We want to look at that data and figure out, does that make sense as a commercial drug trial in the anxiety space? That could be worth quite a lot of money in market cap to our company. So I think we'll continue to look at that. In terms of what we're planning to do in Basel, it's really a platform. It's the ability to test things with rigor and science with a team of people that have been working on psychedelics for 10 plus years. We don't have to go out and build a team to look at LSD and understand how to design drug trials. These people know what they are doing. The Swiss are very attention oriented, and they have a legacy on LSD and this broader modern psychedelic space that has really gone ignored. The Swiss have always stayed at looking at these as medicines. Even Matthias was working, I believe, on MDMA in the early 90s and helping discover the mechanism of action there when he was at another university. This is a great team. There are very few people like Matthias that a company can partner with. These are going to be rate limiting factors, and Switzerland is a strategic place for us.
So, Kevin, I want you to jump in on this too. What metrics, and I think a lot, just generally speaking, because you've been doing this for so long with so much success, what metrics do you use to gauge whether MineMed is successful?
At this point, I'm just looking for the initiation of trials on as many potential, outcomes as possible, because you have to prove the anecdotal data. You have to prove the thesis that it can have a positive effect on all these massive afflictions we've been talking about today. That's what matters. That's what the company has to spend 90% of its energy on, is pushing forward the thesis that it can have positive outcomes in terms of solving these massive problems. And that the only way to get that is the data, and the trials is the FDA approved trials. That is the nature of this type of investment. That's why, markets try, and these investments are speculative, and markets try and look forward, say, what is the possibility that any one of these, drugs that MineMed is pursuing, or medicines, is going to work. And then it's just waiting for data. And it's always the same in these, I'm involved in another one that does stroke research. It's been a boneyard for investors, and it's in its 10th year. You have to have a long-term view of this, but you put that against the potential of the medicine's value to society, value to the markets, value on the economic front. These are huge opportunities. They are. That's what intrigued me about the whole MineMed thing in the first place. They're not pursuing some tiny vertical. These are massive, massive, massive markets. Every one is multi-billion. You only need one to work, but you don't know which one, and you don't know when. It's a waiting game, and if you don't have the appetite to wait, don't do that. Don't invest in it. But I'm intrigued, and I invest in a lot of things, and I just say it's intriguing to think about being an investor in something this big if it works. It's really interesting, and I hope for all the companies in this space, not just MineMed. Look, everybody has someone in their family that has been touched by alcoholism. I have in mine, or by drug addiction. I have that in mind too. Like, I want solutions. I would love to be an investor and solve that problem for my own, extended family. And that's how I feel about it.
Well, it's interesting because there's this kind of it's this thing happening, is particularly with younger investors that want to invest in what they believe are socially responsible investments, something that they want to invest alongside their values. They want to invest in something that they believe will make the world a better place. I know this is not pitched as something like that, but but again, you're talking about the massiveness of this, how many people this is going to be able to help. I mean, it could easily be argued that this is absolutely a value-based investment as well. Would you agree with that?
Of course, I mean it's sort of, that is why I'm investing in this. I would like to have exposure to a solution like this. Every once in a while, there's different kinds of investments. There's ones where you're paying a multiple of cash flow and you're trying to determine what the yield on a position is. I do all those investments. I'm involved in that sector. I mean, I do that with in the ETF world where I participate. This is not that kind of investment. This is a highly speculative, binary outcome investment of zero or something immense. And it's very hard to determine where on that spectrum you are at this time. The only thing the company can do is generate data, as the industry has to. And so, but now we finally got enough interest in it, primarily in my views, personal opinion, because nothing else works. It just doesn't, and it's such horrible medicine who wants to give a child Ritalin? Like, who wants to give,
right.
That's horrible stuff, but a frustrated parent has no choice. What do? And so, I look at it that way and say, Adderall, I wouldn't give that to an animal, but a frustrated parent has no choice.
Yeah.
And so we got to give them choice. That's what this research is about. There's an aspect to it of solving a big problem, and that's what always was attractive to the whole thing. And then, of course, the potential for it to be an institutional investment, which is important for me, because I don't see developing medicines unless you have institutional capital behind you. And we've talked about that, and we know the path to that. This company will not participate in all that stuff on recreational psychedelics. So for me, it's so you understand the investment thesis I have on it.
It's interesting. I've noticed over the past 40 minutes since we've had this conversation that the word data has come up multiple times. And JR, MineMed made an announcement yesterday that will ultimately provide more of this data that we're seeking. Can you talk about this new technology, the LSD Neutralizer, and why this is important and what you're planning to do with this technology?
Yeah, for sure. I'm just looking I think a third of the questions are around our data, IP, looking at this new news. So let me talk a little bit about the news, about the LSD Neutralizer, and then I'll get into the patent policy a bit. On the LSD Neutralizer, what we saw was really starts with a problem, right? We're solving big problems, but a lot of people, because of the stigma, they're a bit anxious to even think about going into one of our trials or eventually maybe taking our medicine when it gets approved. And the major question that I get as CEO of MineMed is, well, what happens if I have a bad trip or a challenging trip? And my answer to that is twofold. One, challenging trips and bad trips can actually be therapeutic, and sometimes you want to push through those. There's a reason those experiences help people. But there are times where it's really just too much. And we've heard this complaint. Our chief medical officer, Scott Freeman, has interviewed a lot of therapists in the space, and they basically said, look, if we could tell people that there was a emergency stop button, there would be, I think, a little bit more anxiety going into that experience and actually getting to a peak experience because they weren't so anxious about it, dealing with some of those issues, knowing that there is, I can tap out. And so we ultimately, our job as a company, why we're investing capital, is to make a good patient experience. We're obsessed about our patients, and we should ultimately use technologies that are going to make better experiences. And so that is what the LSD Neutralizer is focused on is giving both the patient and the therapist a better way to conduct these therapies. And so we'll continue to make patent filings against novel and new technologies that we think are going to be beneficial to patients. And talking a bit about our patent policy, look, LSD and psilocybin, you can't patent them. I mean, actually here, this is the original patent application. I don't know if you can see it from Albert Hoffman back in, let's see here, 1948 is when they filed this in the United States, okay? We're not going to file a patent on LSD as a compound, and nor should any other company or nonprofit in the space want to file a patent application based on a substance that's been in the public domain. That is a clear and violation of patent law and breaks down our patent system. However, if you are working on something that is innovative, that integrates LSD into it, that integrates another psychedelic, then we should want to encourage investment into that space. And I think this is a big, sort of debate within our industry and our community. Should you be able to patent psychedelics? They've been around for a while. We've known about them. Well, LSD started out in a pharmaceutical company. If Albert Hoffman didn't have the resources of Sandoz Laboratories to work on LSD, it would have never been discovered. So our thoughts are, yes, we're going to patent things, but we're hopefully also going to discover some really interesting new things in our phase 2 and phase 3 studies as we move forward about how these medicines work in our body and, better ways to administer them, better ways to manufacture them, how to make them safer. So, I think this is a key thing for us, and we're quite confident in our patent strategy. But rest assured, we're not going to try to patent psilocybin as a molecule or patent LSD as a molecule. That is not our intent, and we think that's not cool. So yeah, that's what we're working on.
We have again, I wanted to get a couple more questions from some folks that submitted questions earlier. We have a question from Troy who has asked, are you looking to acquire more companies similar to what the cannabis sector did, or are you trying to preserve as much cash as possible and then move forward with the company, with what the company has now and gain value from that?
Yeah, I mean, look, there really isn't much to acquire out there. We've looked, there's a bunch of upstart companies. There's a bunch of companies that are planning to go public, most of those smaller. We don't see anything really to acquire. There's nothing that we can't produce internally that they are necessarily working on. So we might make one small acquisition in the future, but really the way that we look at acquisition are internal acquisitions. We have some great data on LSD. Let's convert that data and those clinical drug trials into commercial drug trials and start our own drug trials. And I think as shareholders that are on this call, they should rest assured we're not going to be overly dilutive by going out and doing the early days of cannabis. You saw these like terrible stock swap deals.
Yeah.
That you probably followed along. Like, that's not how we want to build our company. We want to build our company by, generating real value, generating IP, patents, clinical trials that our team, which is Don Gellert, our chief scientific officer, he worked at Eli Lilly. He took a drug in the ADHD market from discovery to FDA phase 3 approval called Strattera. We want to do stuff like that. That's where you get binary outcomes that Kevin's talking about. And so I think that's going to be our focus. Not really interested in the acquisition side. I do think we'll have partnerships with larger pharma companies, way farther down the line as we advance our phase 2 trials. But I don't think acquisitions are on the docket.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about Johnson & Johnson's esketamine and how that opened doors within the psychedelic industry? And really, how does this relate to your drug development program?
Yeah, so Johnson & Johnson got breakthrough therapy designation. I think they took their phase 2 to phase 3. I think it took about 3 years for treatment-resistant depression. around there. Breakthrough therapy designation, I think for most of the things that we're working on is going to be available, probably maybe not ADHD, but definitely on the addiction side, definitely on the anxiety side. Once we have some phase 2 data that is interesting, I think we can go and definitely on the opioid side. I think there's a lot of urgency in Washington right now to find new solutions to the opioid side. I'm just seeing here another question. Why LSD, not psilocybin? So I think on the reason around this is we didn't see many people working on LSD. Actually, we thought there was an underinvestment in the LSD space. And so we were able to acquire data at favorable terms and strike partnerships at favorable terms. And we saw a lot of people focusing on psilocybin rushing in there. There's actually not as much safety data. Most of the work from the 1940s to 60s was done on LSD. It wasn't done on psilocybin. So that's part of our thesis on that. I just want to answer that one. I think it's from Tyler. No, it's an anonymous. So
okay.
That's
Thank you, Anonymous.
Mr. Anonymous.
I have a question here on broader market dynamics for Kevin. Kevin, it's been a very tough market that MineMed listed in. How do you think the recovery, or how long do you think the recovery is going to take? And do you think MineMed will still be able to do well in a market recovery market?
Well, MineMed has done remarkably well in a terrible market with a lot of volatility. Investors in MineMed are probably, and I'm speculating when I say this because I don't, I know why I invested, but they're probably trying to get exposure to the outcome of this sector and the potential upside of solving the problems we've been talking about all afternoon. It's sort of, it doesn't have a lot to do with next quarter because we know that it's going to take time. So it's kind of a long-term view of the upside of this industry that would make you like a large investor in it. And that's sort of what I'm looking at. The market conditions out there are running off what I call the Como Index. People watch the news out of New York each day. New York is now the center of the world on this thing. The best way to view it, I think, is a giant cruise ship, a 75-story cruise ship sitting on a rock that doesn't go anywhere with a really lot of people on it that are, unfortunately getting infected. And until we see the green shoots of New York's outcome, the markets will continue to be volatile. But I don't see MineMed really connected, at least in my view. It's not really a market participant to that. It's a brand new nascent company. It's pursuing data, and either you want to be involved with that or you don't. I mean, that's kind of the decision you make as an investor. And and how it trades, who knows? And it just as more information comes into the market about the value or the potential of each of these trials, I think that's what solidifies the investor base. And eventually, if the data is proven, will, in my view, attract institutions.
Right. Got it. So, JR, after you get through phase 1 and phase 2 testing on 18MC, do you think it would be considered eligible for FDA Fast Track status, given that it potentially fills an urgent unmet medical need?
Yeah, I think we'll be going into a phase 2 by the end of this year on 18MC. That's an inflection point people should look for. I think that's when when you get into phase 2s, that's when ultimately the larger pharmaceutical companies look to help fund your trial, give you sort of potential for R&D reimbursements. So I think those are things that we're going to be looking at. Getting breakthrough therapy designation is a huge value inflection point for any company. And it's definitely something that we're going to be addressing. I think there's a pretty good chance, just given the urgency of the opioid crisis. It's very rare that you're working on something where both sides of the aisle are going to, say that's a good thing. Fund that. So while the FDA is not necessarily a political organization, a lot of the funding that National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Institute of Health, you need Congress ultimately to give those organizations more funding, and they need it to look at innovative solutions. So we'll be looking at that, moving forward. I just saw one other question that I thought was interesting, and it says is 18MC ibogaine, and does it I can't see, I'm scrolling through it. There's so many questions here, but let me just address the 18MC versus ibogaine discussion that a lot of people are curious about. 18MC is derived from ibogaine. It is ibogaine is based off the iboga bush from West Africa. What our company and Stan Glick, who invented 18MC, thought was that addiction ultimately was a dysregulation of something called dopamine in the brain, and he was looking to create a safer ibogaine, and that is what we are focused on. He's removed some of the cardiac issues that are surround ibogaine and some of the other ibogaine derivatives that are out there. We don't think that ibogaine will ever get passed as an FDA medicine, and we have no interest in investing it. We are trying to bring our phase 2 trial to ultimately get 18MC proven that it works. We know in animal models that it's as effective as ibogaine without a hallucinogenic experience, and so I think that's extremely interesting.
There is a question here that looks interesting as well from Steven. He says, my son suffers from severe OCD and has wanted these meds to address his OCD. Do you plan on addressing this group of patients?
It's not something that we're immediately looking at. I think it is a very interesting cause, and there are a lot of afflictions that we have up on the board. But as a company, you need to have a focus, and we will continue to put up phase 2 trials around new things that we want to work on. So yes, we'll be looking at that. Ultimately, if we're going to build a big company, we're going to need to have multiple trials. But right now, we're focused on the 2 that we have.
I see quite a few questions here from investors too. JR says, I'm a young professional looking to invest in MineMed. Curious what my path is to making an investment.
Path to making an investment.
I think he probably just wants to know where, what if he wants to invest, where does it trade?
Sure.
The NEO.
So we're listed on a NEO exchange. It's a great exchange. Kevin and I rang the bell together. It was a very good listing process. That's up in Canada. We trade under the ticker MMED. Down in the US, we just were upgraded to the venture board, the OTCQB. And so we trade under the ticker MMEDF, and that is all on our website, minemed.co.
I would like time for one more. I really want to get this one in from Glenn. He says, hey, Jeff, stop asking softball questions and be a real interviewer. Ask about the competition. Who does MineMed compete with?
Great question. We compete with what we see as 2 companies in the space. They are Compass Pathways, which is invested by Peter Thiel, and then Atai Life Sciences, which is quasi-shareholder in Compass. Compass is focused on using psilocybin for depression. We are not looking at the psilocybin space, so not direct competitors. In terms of other players in the space that aren't necessarily competition, but in the nonprofit space, you have MAPS working on MDMA. They have worked very diligently. It's taken 34 years, but they, I think, are very close to getting an approval in the not too distant future on MDMA for PTSD. It's a very an amazing cause. And also you have the USONA Institute, which is also working on psilocybin for depression, the same indication as Compass. Yeah, that's about it. Oh, there's one other company that's also focused on LSD, but not for mental health. They're focused on inflammation, which is called Eleusis. So yeah, I mean, those are what we consider the pharmaceutical grade companies that really have the teams to ultimately bring these things forward. There's tons of other companies out there that have a pitch deck and suddenly have access to some psilocybin or a mushroom farm. We don't necessarily consider them competition.
Right. Okay, so we're in an hour. I know we have a lot of questions, but we have to max this out at an hour. So we will have to wrap this up. I do appreciate everyone joining our discussion around the topic of psychedelics and how this industry is changing. JR, Kevin, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to educate us. And hopefully we can do one of these again in the future, because I know there are a lot more questions that would like to be answered.